With a printed fabric or a printed cotton, you can usually tell the right and wrong side of the fabric because the right side has a more vibrant color and the wrong side has just the remnants or the shadow of the print. So with most fabrics and most costumes, we will put our seam allowance on the wrong side of fabric. So then that way we never see the work, and outside of the garment you just see a nice clean finished seam. So to do that, I'll take my two pieces of my sample and I'm going to fold them so that the two right sides are touching and facing each other. And I'll actually apply my seam along one side, so that way when the seam is finished, all we'll see is that folded edge and all the work will live on the inside. And there's a few different ways to go about that. One is that I can draw my 5/8 seam allowance and actually draw the line, or I can use those marks on the throat plate that I told you about. But the important thing is making sure that your edges are nice and lined up, and that when you pin, you start with your ends and you pin perpendicularly to your intended stitch line. These are pins that you can actually leave in while you're sewing. You don't have to remove them. So I'll pin my two ends and then I'll pin my center. Because these pieces are the same size, I don't have to stretch my fabric to fit. And then between those, I'll pin some pins on the intended stitch line. So had I been marking a seam line, I could have taken my quilter's ruler and counted 5 boxes for a 5/8 or 4 boxes for a 1/2 inch, lined that up with my fabric edge, and then drawn my line. But for this sample, I'll be showing you guys as if it was a commercial pattern, and we'll use those cut lines on the throat plate. But the important thing to know when pinning is that as you feed your sample into the machine, think of the directionality that your pins are facing. You always want the balls of the pin tops to be facing towards you, so then that way they're a lot easier to remove while you're stitching. It can be a real pain to try to scoop around and pull those pins out as you're going through the machine. So similar to our samples, in this case I'm going to line up my cut edge on my first long line, on my 5/8 line, and lower my presser foot in place. I'll make sure that I'm on a regular stay stitch, which is a number 3 of length and a 0 on my zigzag. And right now, as long as I keep my fabric edge lined up with this 5/8 line, I will be stitching in 5/8 into my fabric to create that seam allowance. 5/8 is a nice standard commercial seam allowance, whereas a lot of theatrical sewing, we make a larger seam allowance to allow for those alterations that will most likely happen in the future. So for a nice straight seam like this, we'll just do 5/8 for our sample. So similar to our straight stitch, I'll hold my threads under my fabric, and I'll just start, and then I'll backstitch a couple spaces. And now that I've backstitched, I'm free to complete the rest of my seam. Once I get close to these parallel pins, I'll pull them out. And then as I come on the end, then I'll just come almost to the end of my seam, and then I'll backstitch before coming back there again. So now I have my seam finished, but not quite finished. I'm going to trim my thread tails. And then I want you guys to know a rule. A seam is never finished until it's pressed. So I'm going to run over to the iron and just press this open so that you can see what this seam looks like when it's actually finished. And so now you can see that this seam is nice and flat and pressed open. For this next sample, I'll show you a gathered seam, in which case we are gathering one larger piece down to a smaller piece. You'll see this a lot in aprons or skirts onto waistbands. The first step that we'll have to do though is to actually apply some machine basting to our longer piece that will allow us to gather this down to fit onto our main piece. I'm going to line up my presser foot with the edge of my fabric, and that will allow me to be stitching in 1/4 of an inch into my fabric piece here. And so to make it a machine based, I'm going to turn it to a 5, And because I intend to use this thread as a way to gather fabric, I'm not going to apply any backstitching in. And because I'm going to be using these threads to pull down, I'm going to leave a rather long tail, so then that way I have something to hold on to. However, just having one row of basting could be dangerous if that thread were to break. So when we're hand gathering, we'll always use two. So I'm going to line up my presser foot edge with that old stitch, or that first stitch line. And actually what that will do is mean that I'm now stitching a 1/4 inch away from that stitch line. So I'll go ahead and repeat one more row of basting. So when working with this hand basting, what's important to know is that we now have 4 threads on either side. We have our 2 top threads and our 2 bobbin threads. And so I'm going to make sure that I can separate those 4 threads apart so that as I pull on a pair of threads, I'm pulling on either the 2 from the top or the 2 from the bottom. But when I pull from either side of my sample, I'll make sure that I'm pulling the same ones. Otherwise, at some point, they'll cross and I won't be able to pull anymore. So if I was working on a larger sample, say a skirt hem or a ruffle or something, you usually want to mark your centers of your samples. And a fast way to do that is to take that piece, fold it in half, and either mark with a pencil on the wrong side, or put a pin into that fold, right on fold. And that marks the center of one side. And I'll do the same on my ruffled piece, my longer piece. So then that way, when I'm pinning these together, much like your plain seam, you can pin your ends and you can pin your center, and it gives you some good marking places. So now I have my 4 threads and my 2 marked centers. So I'm going to place this as if I was doing a plain seam. And I'll lay my right sides together, and I can use one of these pins to set that center, and I'm making sure that my edges of my fabrics are nice and lined up. But then I'll go and pin my 2 ends, making sure that those corners are nice and square. And I'll pin the other end as well. So now what I have to do is pull all of my excess down so that my ruffled layer matches my plain layer. So finding those 2 threads and getting rid of the ones that I don't need, just kind of hold them off to the side. And now if I pull on those threads while applying a little bit of pressure to my fabric, it can actually start to gather down. So I'll keep gathering until my fabric gets closer to being the same size. And you can always pull it pretty quickly and then disperse your gathers, but the important thing is that as you're working, your 2 layers start to become really close together, and that you're not pulling your gathered layer so tight that it makes the bottom layer buckle. So you're using your flat layer as a way to make sure that you're pulling your threads enough. And then once you have it into a good place or a good tension, then you can go in and start organizing your ruffles and your gathers and making sure that they're evenly distributed. And then you can turn it around and do the same on the opposite side, making sure that you're pulling with the same pairs of threads as you did from that first time. And because I'm only pinning perpendicularly, I'll actually be able to sew from whichever side I want, be it the flat side or the gathered side. But I won't necessarily worry with this kind of cotton of pinning perpendicularly. So taking it over to the machine, this is now to be sewn just like a plain seam. I'm going to line up my presser foot so that the fabric hits that 5/8 seam allowance line again. So now I'll stitch one more time like a plain seam, which means I'm putting my machine back to a 3 or to a stay stitch. I'll hold my threads to start, and I will backstitch at the beginning and the end. And so now I can pull out all of my pins. And I can trim my thread tails. In theater, we don't often have to take out our basting lines because, especially if they're hidden in the seam allowance, we'll never see them on the outside of the garment. And even if they're straddling your stitch line, they'll be hidden in kind of the shadow of that seam. And also it'll help us do alterations in the future if we still have these basting threads in there. The last thing to do is to press this seam open so that you can see how that ruffle takes effect. And once that's pressed open, now you can see all the gathers hanging nice and flat. And if this was the world's tiniest skirt or apron, you can see how gathering gives a little bit of volume and movement to the hem of something. This third machine sample that we'll work on is called the French seam. And it's a way to finish fabric so that the seam allowance is actually hidden and enclosed. You see this a lot with couture garments and things of a very high quality, but also of shears and fabrics that you don't necessarily want to see a serged or a pinked or a cut edge through the garment. French seams can be really beautiful, but they're also not always the best for theater because they don't allow for any kind of alterations afterwards. Once you French seam something, you're pretty much committed to those seam lines. And so in theater, we might French seam a lot of the seams and then leave something open or available or extra seam allowance somewhere else to add to a little bit more maneuverability with that garment. But essentially a French seam is two plain seams done on the same seam so that it captures the seam allowance in it. So the steps are the same, except whereas the plain seam, we would start by putting our fabric's right sides together so that once it's sewn, you only see the seam on the outside. What a French seam does is flips that on its head. So the first thing we'll do is put our wrong sides together, touching, and we'll pin the same way we did with the plain seam, matching our edges and pinning perpendicularly, and then tapping out and pinning the center, and then in between pinning parallel on our intended stitch lines, and we'll bring it over to the machine. The difference being is that a French seam still takes up 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance. And so rather than stitching once at 5/8 like we did our plain seam, we're going to stitch twice, the first one being at 3/8 and the second one being at 1/4 inch. So 3/8 plus 1/4 inch, aka 2/8, equals 5/8. So the goal of a French seam is to not take up more seam allowance than other seams, to just break down those 5/8 into two separate pieces. So going over to our machine and lining up our presser or our fabric edge with that first line on our throat plate. So the edge of our presser foot is 1/4 inch, the first line is 3/8. And then I'll treat it like a plain seam. So holding onto my threads, making sure that my machine is at a 3 or a stay stitch, I'll start forward, back stitch, and then following that fabric edge on that 3/8 stitch line, I'll keep working my way down this piece of sample. Now I'm going to go and trim my thread tails, but the important part for the next step is if I were just to start and go for the next step, which is to fold my seam allowance in, so then that way I'm hiding all of my work. If I stitch at a 1/4 inch, I'll pin it as if I'm stitching at a 1/4 inch. I want you to see if you guys will notice. So that's about a 1/4 inch, about the breadth of your pinky nail. When I open this up, you see how there's still a lot of seam allowance visible, those little fringy bits? So the next step of a French seam is to press this first seam open and then to trim your first seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. So I've pressed my seam open, so from the wrong side you can see that it's nice and flat. But now I'm going to go ahead and trim down my seam allowances so that they're roughly about 1/2 of this distance. So I'm aiming to trim down to about 1/8 of an inch. The goal is to trim it down so that this new baby seam allowance will fit inside your 1/4 inch seam allowance that you're going to do next as the second seam of your French seam. And so that now that this is trimmed, then I can go and pin my next seam allowance. So folding your fabric so that the first seam is nice on edge, I'm going to pinch it tight and then start with my ends and pin those first, and making sure that that first seam line stays right on edge. And then I'll pin my center. And then I'll pin perpendicularly. But it's important to pin in this alternating fashion to allow your fabric to stay nice and in place. And so just like the first seam, we'll lower the presser foot, but in this case, we're going to line up our fabric edge with the edge of our presser foot. And that means we're stitching a 1/4 inch in from the edge of the fabric. But from there on, it's the same as the earlier steps. You'll start forward. After about a 1/4 inch, you'll backstitch and then complete the seam. And the last step is to take out those pins, to trim your tails, and then one last time we'll take it to the iron. But unlike the other seams, you can't press this open. So the term I'm going to use is called breaking the seam, where with your iron, and it's my hand, you'll push the seam to one side, and then you'll push the seam to the other. And what that does is that it forces your seam to lay nice and flat, and then you can push your seam allowance to one direction. And there you have your French seam. From the outside, it looks exactly like a plain seam if done on non-sheer fabric. But on the inside, you have this beautiful encapsulated seam allowance. So if this was a plain seam, we would just put our fabric together, right sides touching, and then have that be the end of it. But we want to actually add some cording in here. So you've each gotten a piece of pre-made cording, which is just a little piece of cotton rope that has bias cut fabric around it. Bias has some stretch to it, which allows for it to curve and move, which is why often you'll see piped edges in couches and furniture or in garments, and they can take that curve. So your piece should be just long enough to go beyond your sample. So the important thing is we're not going to just layer all these three things together. We're going to ignore one piece first. We're going to place our cording on the right side of our fabric. If you're ever uncertain of how something is supposed to look, is that if you lay it together and fold it on the intended seam lines, that should give you a visual of what to expect. And so at the end of the day, we want to have our seam allowances hidden with our little piping, little cording edge sticking out. And if we were to fold that back, you would see that's the organization. You're sandwiching your green fabric onto the cording, onto the other green fabric. But if you do that all in one go, you might get something that pokes out funny or gets messed up. So we're gonna go step by step. So using this stitch line on our cording piece, that's what's kind of holding it all together. We're gonna use that as a guide on one side, and then our stitch line as our guide on the other. So pinning through my cording piece, I'm going to pin through that and then come out right on my stitch line on the other side. And I'll work my way down, trying not to crimp my fabric. So I'm pinning through that stitch line and coming out on the drawn red line on that side. Now, in order to start stitching our corded seam, we need to change our foot to the zipper foot. What this allows is a skinnier foot that lets the needle get closer to what you're stitching for when we need to stitch a zipper, but it's also really helpful for when we're doing a corded seam or anything that has bulk on one side of the seam. So just like when we did the buttonhole, we're going to lift up by a little latch in the back and pull off your foot and replace it with the other foot. But what you'll notice, a lot of what we've done has center placement when it comes to our needle, but if you see right now, if we tried that, our needle would smash to smithereens. So we're going to move our needle all the way over by clicking this 2 soft pushes over to the left. So that way our needle is actually in one of these grooves for its purpose. And we have our threads going out and towards the back and not looping around the foot, otherwise they'll get caught in our work. We've talked about needing to make sure that our needle placement was over to the side of the extreme left, so that way it was as close as it could get to the bulk of the cording. But you also want to make sure that your stitch length is at 3, because we're working with stay stitches here, things that we want to stay put, so we're keeping it at the number 3. So stitching from the right side of the fabric and the cording, I'm aiming to stitch right on this stitch line of the cording. So I've lowered my presser foot, making sure that the edge of the presser foot is lined up with the bulk of this cording or with that stitch line. And then from here on, it's just like a plain seam. I'm going to hold my threads to start, I'll stitch a little ways forward, then backstitch, and then continue on stitching. And just because this can get persnickety, I am going to throw a few more pins in, just to help keep things in place. Because when you're at the machine, it might end up warbling on you. So from this point on, it's basically just like a plain seam. You'll take your 2 pieces of green fabric, you'll lay them right sides together with your seam allowances lined up, and then just like before, I'm going to pin through one stitch line and then come out the other on the opposite side. And because we know these to be the same piece or the same length, I'm just going to match my edges first. And I'll pin through that red stitch line and come out. See how I've missed it? So I'm just going to scooch my pin over just like that so it lines up, and then pivot. And then pin the center through that red line, come out on that red line, and then I'll pin parallel, double checking my work to make sure that I have hit both lines. Ideally on this underside, our stitch line and our marked line are the same. And if there's a little difference, it'll be okay, because actually the bulk of the cording can hide any number of errors. Alright, and then once you have this pinned, it's ready to be sewn like a plain seam. So now that we have our pieces pinned together, we'll keep the same settings as before. Zigzag on 0, needle placement all the way to the left, and stitch length on 3. So lifting up the presser foot, I'll place the fabric so that my drawn stitch line is lined up with the leftmost edge of that zipper foot. Holding my threads to start, I'll go forward and then I'll backstitch and then I'll keep stitching like a plain seam. So I'm feeling for the bulk of the cording. If you don't want to have your hands too close, you can go further back or be closer up here. But your goal is to aim for that stitch line to feed in right to the left of your zipper foot. And remember to leave your pins in as you go over the edge. Otherwise, your fabric could separate and you get a weird little bloop at the end. So complete the stitch. And then with scissors, I'm actually going to trim all my thread tails at once on both sides. And I'll trim off that edge of the cording as well. So then that way I'm prepped to take this to the iron. And now that you have your corded seam all stitched, you can see how the pieces all work together, where you have your corded, your white cording, caught between the two layers of your plain seam. So unlike the real plain seam, where you can just press all this flat and open, you do have that cording to worry about. So really, we're going to pull this nice and open, and then we're not going to try to split the cording necessarily in the middle. We're going to press that white to one side. But you're still going to press your green as open as you can make it. Because of the cording, we're doing what's called, like in the French seam, we're breaking the seam, where now we're going to iron it the opposite direction. And what that does is help to open the seam up as much as possible without poking it in any one given direction.